Okay, recommendation 8, I think the one you all have been waiting for. Make the number of nights a unit can be used as a hosted or unhosted short-term rental at 120 days, adjusted as needed if future studies can confirm the point where such use would incentivize the illegal conversion of residential units to full-time tourist use per the changes proposed in the mayoral ordinance.
Commissioner Antonini.
Well, based upon our study from, and I forget the gentleman's name, but the UC Berkeley. Marquesi, yeah. He said the break-even point was about 250, if I'm not mistaken, 257, at least in his opinion. So we certainly could go to 180. I don't know if there's enough votes to do that, but I think it would be a little more realistic, especially when we're squeezing the hosted guys down to a lower number too. But I would be supportive of a minimum of 120.
Commissioner Richards.
I guess here's where I have one concern around not just the fact that you have a vacant unit and you could, whether you want to rent it out long-term or short-term, it's really also, for me, a discussion around, I have a unit with somebody in it, can I get them out? Because if I get 180 days and, they're been around many, many years and their rent is significantly less, the delta is still very great. So I'm not for increasing it. This is where I would step in and say, I would recommend at the end a bucket list, and I'm going to bring up the expedited process around actually extremely streamlined CU process for a bed and breakfast so that people can rent their single-family homes out for a whole year if they'd like. So, 120 days seems a little high to me. 90 days seems a little more occasional. It's a season. I'd like to see this actually at 90 with the caveat that we have a bed and breakfast item on the list later.
Commissioner Moore.
I would agree with the department's position just to leave it with 90 for the time being until the department and the city better understands how it plays it out to the full extent.
Sorry, Commissioner, just to be clear, we are recommending the 120.
Then I cannot support that.
Okay.
Commissioner Hillis.
So I'm supportive of the 120, although I go back to kind of the hosted, non-hosted. I think 120 is too high for unhosted, and I like the 90 or even going lower on unhosted, because I think that's what we're trying to get at. Those are people who don't live in the unit. They don't necessarily care about less concerned about their neighbors and what their neighbors feel like. I think we got compelling public testimony that a hosted unit, people, one, rely on the income. These aren't, overwhelmingly wealthy people who are living in luxury units and renting out bedrooms. I think they deserve 120 or even more. But I think if we're going to do this kind of hosted and unhosted are the same, I would go with the 120.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, I'm favoring it sounds like 120 is probably where our decision is going to be on the highest end. And I think we're providing a lot of other ways to police this for the host that is using it, in lieu of full-time rental. So I think that we've got a lot of other checks on the whole thing, and it does allow for the hosted people to have at least a little more, and they will have to go into the bed and breakfast, as Commissioner Richards said, but I'm fine with the 120.
Commissioner Wu.
Commissioner Richards raises, I always do this. Commissioner Hillis raises some really good points. I am in favor of having it be just one number, but to me, 90 and 120 both seem really high for unhosted. It's, sort of where you're out of town, you're on vacation, something like that. So I would be supportive of this idea of maybe some sort of streamlined bed and breakfast, but I don't think that we've actually researched it enough to really understand what that would be quite yet.
Commissioner Hillis.
Not to belabor this, but I've got questions too on that breaking point from the study, 257. It seems way high. And I think the breaking point is could be lower than 120 for non-hosted. You just run this as a rental property. I got to dig through the numbers, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem right to me, the 257.
I think it depends on what you're looking at. We did check the numbers with the controller's office, Mr. Ted Egan, the city's chief economist, and he said that his ranges may be coming along in about the same order. The thing to note is what we're talking about is the break-even point where you become incentivized to switch from long-term rental to short-term rental.
Right.
And there is also a certain profit level below that where, it might not be, and again, this is the average, right? So there are definitely some where it becomes, the incentive is much earlier and somewhere it's much later. But there might also be a number where the amount of profit is enough that even though it's not more than a long-term rental, it's enough for you not to do long-term rental.
Yeah, and we heard that. I mean, people who, there are a lot of vacant units, and there are people who just don't put their units on the rental market. And if they're able to lease for 120 days in short term, that may be good enough for them. Again, that's an unhosted rental. I would rather see that down at 90 in the hosted rental, but I get the difficulty of enforcing that.
Commissioner Hillis, is this something that if we ever make it to item number 14 here and get to items that you want to list or add, is this something you would suggest merging in thought at least number 1 and number 8 if there was a way to differentiate or define hosted versus and pick a separate number for each one of them?
Yeah, or at least consider separating hosted and non-hosted and having
two different numbers
but
accordingly, right? Yeah. 2 different nights. Okay.
Commissioner, shall I call the question then on recommendation number 8?
Yes, please.
So on recommendation number 8, making the maximum number of nights that can be used as a hosted or unhosted short-term rental at 120 days. Commissioner Antonini?
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis?
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Moore?
No.
Commissioner Richards?
No.
Commissioner Wu?
No.
And Commission President Fong?
Aye.
So that recommendation will move forward 4-3 with Commissioners Moore, Richards, and Wu voting against.